Motion in your step.
Motivation in your heart.
Hello, and welcome to today's Motion and Motivation podcast.
We've put together a study guide for everyone. If you need it, you can grab it from the video description.
Okay, so get ready, because we are diving into some pretty heavy stuff today.
Oh, yeah.
Victor Davis Hanson's The Case for Trump.
Okay.
And this book, whether you love Trump or hate him, this book is provocative.
Yeah.
It throws some serious punches, and today we're going to unpack them.
I think that's one of the things that struck me about Hanson's approach is that he doesn't just take sort of a blow-by-blow defense of Trump's actions, but he really kind of zooms out and tries to give you this sense of an America that was already deeply fractured before Trump even came on the scene.
Yeah.
And he calls this the new red-blue split.
Right. And it's not just rich versus poor, though.
No, it's way more nuanced than that. He really argues it's this geographic and cultural chasm that has opened up between what he calls the coastal elites and the forgotten interior of the country.
Okay.
So, he contrasts sort of the world of Silicon Valley with its, tech billionaires and its kind of global outlook against struggling rural towns where globalization has really hit hard.
Yeah.
And he doesn't just keep it general. He actually gets really specific. He talks about these stark income disparities, the different values that are placed on education and tradition.
Yeah, he uses this example of how people in San Francisco were more upset about a local cheese shop closing than they were about, the loss of manufacturing jobs in the Central Valley.
Exactly. And I think that anecdote really speaks volumes about this disconnect that Hanson's trying to highlight. Yeah. And he says this divide, created fertile ground for resentment to take root, the forgotten interior feeling ignored, even looked down upon.
Yeah, and he's not shy about calling out academics and media figures for this.
No, he's not.
He quotes some pretty harsh things that were said about flyover country.
And I think by highlighting that, he's trying to show just how much this perceived arrogance fueled the fire. This feeling of being talked down to, of having your values dismissed, is what Hanson believes really primed a huge chunk of the population to be receptive to Trump's message.
Yeah.
And so I think, in a way, it became less about Trump the person and more about Trump as a vessel for this.
It's not just about his personality.
Right.
As polarizing as it may be.
Exactly.
Hanson's saying there are these deeper forces at work here.
Absolutely.
This simmering anger that explains his rise.
He says Trump tapped into this very real anxiety about American decline.
Okay.
This feeling that the country was losing its way, its identity on the world stage.
And he doesn't present this decline as inevitable.
Right.
Like it's not some Greek tragedy where the ending is already written.
Exactly. He argues that it's a direct result of choices made by the political establishment, who he believes essentially sold out the American worker in favor of globalist policies.
Wow.
And to drive his point home, he uses these striking historical parallels.
Like what?
He compares America to ancient Rome, a once great power brought low by its own internal divisions and its misguided priorities.
So where does Hillary Clinton fit into all of this?
Well, she's a really crucial part of his argument.
Okay.
He claims that Trump wasn't just running on his own merits, but he was the un-Hillary, the antithesis of everything she represented.
Right, and this is before she even ran for president.
Exactly. This book was written in 2017 during Trump's first year in office.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this fascinating snapshot of the political landscape at the time.
Right.
Now, Hanson doesn't let Trump off the hook for his behavior.
Of course not.
But he argues that Clinton's own vulnerabilities and scandals, real or perceived, created this opening that someone like Trump could exploit.
Yeah. He brings up Benghazi.
Oh, yeah.
The Clinton Foundation, the Uranium One deal.
It gets intense.
It gets very intense.
Yeah.
And he uses these examples to paint her as this symbol of a political establishment that many Americans had grown to distrust.
Right.
This idea of a political dynasty operating above the law, playing by a different set of rules.
Exactly. And don't forget her post-election behavior.
Oh, yeah.
Pouring gasoline on the fire.
The deplorables. Comment those speeches she gave abroad, criticizing Trump and his supporters.
For a lot of Trump supporters, this just confirmed everything they already suspected.
Right.
That they were out of touch, condescending, even hostile to the concerns of ordinary Americans.
So we've got this deeply divided country. People are yearning for change, and then you've got the political establishment that's seen as out of touch, and then boom, Trump shows up.
Right.
And he just taps into all of that frustration. But Hansen says it wasn't just the Democrats he was battling, right?
No.
He brings up this whole deep state thing,
Yeah,
working against him even from inside his own party.
that's right. He says Trump was essentially fighting a war on two fronts.
Okay.
On one side, you have the Democrats, but on the other, he's facing fierce opposition from within the Republican Party itself.
Yeah, the never-Trumpers.
Exactly. And from what he calls the deep state.
Okay, so let's break that down for a second.
Yeah.
Because deep state is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot these days.
It is a loaded term.
So what is Hansen actually getting at?
Well, he describes it as this sort of entrenched bureaucracy in Washington.
Okay.
Rear civil servants, intelligence agencies, influential figures in the media.
So not just the government.
Right. It's this broader network of people who are deeply invested in maintaining the status quo.
Interesting.
And because their power transcends whichever party happens to be in control, they see someone like Trump with his outsider status and his drain the swamp rhetoric as a direct threat.
So it's less about ideology for them
Yeah.
and more about just holding on to power.
Exactly. And Hansen argues that Trump's unpredictable nature, his willingness to kind of challenge assumptions even within his own party, made him their worst
It's
nightmare.
like he was shaking things up too much for their liking.
Exactly. And he uses specific examples to kind of illustrate this deep state resistance.
Yeah, like what?
Well, that infamous anonymous op-ed that was published in the New York Times,
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
someone claiming to be a senior official in the Trump administration,
Oh, hey.
basically saying that they were actively working to undermine the president's agenda from within.
It was crazy.
It was huge. And for Hansen, this was a prime example of the deep state in action.
Wow.
He argues that this op-ed, along with the constant leaks coming from within the administration,
Yeah.
were all part of this coordinated effort to sabotage Trump's presidency.
It's like a conspiracy.
Well, Hansen definitely seems to believe there was something more going on.
Right.
And it wasn't just anonymous figures either.
Okay.
He calls out some pretty prominent Republicans, too, the never-Trumpers,
Right.
who actively campaigned against Trump or were just openly critical of his presidency.
He names names, too. I mean, people like Bill Kristol, Max Boot, David Frum.
Yeah.
These weren't exactly fringe figures in the Republican Party.
Yeah. No, they were prominent voices within the conservative movement.
So why does Hansen think they turned on Trump?
Well, he acknowledges that they had a range of motivations. Some opposed Trump purely on policy grounds.
Okay.
They disagreed with his stances on trade or foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
Others were deeply troubled by his character,
Yeah.
his rhetoric,
Right.
what they saw as his authoritarian tendencies.
It was almost like they couldn't stomach him as a person.
Exactly. And Hansen suggests that for some of them, the threat that Trump posed to their vision of America, to democratic norms and institutions, outweighed any kind of loyalty to the Republican Party.
Wow.
They were willing to join forces with Democrats to try to stop him.
So basically he was facing enemies on all sides.
Yeah, and it's kind of fascinating how Hansen weaves all these different threads together
The media, the deep state, the never-Trumpers.
to paint this picture of Trump as this almost besieged figure,
Right.
battling enemies from every direction.
And he's saying that we have to understand that if we really want to make sense of Trump and his presidency.
Right. He doesn't excuse Trump's behavior, but he's suggesting that this constant battle, this sense of being surrounded, helps to explain, at least in part, why Trump was so often on the defensive,
Yeah.
so quick to lash out,
Right.
so willing to break the rules.
It's an interesting argument for sure.
It is. It definitely adds a layer of complexity to the whole thing
For sure.
and forces us to kind of look beyond those really simplistic narratives that we often hear.
But even with all of that chaos, even with all of this opposition,
Right.
Hansen still says that Trump managed to achieve some pretty big things during his time in office.
Absolutely.
And that's actually where things get really interesting.
Yeah. Hansen argues that those successes weren't accidental.
So,
They
yeah.
were a direct result of Trump's policies and leadership.
So we've talked a lot about the political storm surrounding Trump. But Hansen says, hey, look beyond the drama. Look at what he actually got done.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point because he doesn't shy away from the chaos, right? He doesn't pretend it wasn't there.
Right.
But he's saying, okay, let's move past the personality, the tweets, the outrageous sound bites, and focus on the actual record.
So where does Hansen give Trump the biggest gold stars then?
Well, he spends a lot of time on the economy.
Okay.
And remember, this book was written in 2017
Right.
during Trump's first year.
Huh.
So at that point, the economy was doing pretty well. Unemployment was low,
Right.
the stock market was booming, and Hansen argues that a lot of that success goes straight back to Trump's policies.
He's talking specifically about the tax cuts, right?
Yes, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Right.
He argues that those cuts, especially the ones for corporations, really got investment and growth going.
And he also talks about deregulation.
Oh, absolutely. He was big on rolling back regulations.
Right.
Anything he saw as kind of burdensome red tape.
Just kind of get out of the way, let business do its thing.
Exactly. Unleash the potential, he would say.
And this is a common thread with Hansen, too, right?
Yeah.
Because he also gives Trump a lot of credit for getting tough on China, on trade.
Oh, absolutely. And that was huge because, previous administrations had kind of tiptoed around that issue.
Right. They didn't really want to rock the boat too much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Hansen says for decades, China's been playing us on trade, manipulating their currency, stealing intellectual property.
Right.
Not playing fair. And he gives Trump credit for being the first one to really stand up to them.
By using tariffs.
Right. Imposing those tariffs and saying, we're going to renegotiate these deals until we get something better for American workers.
But what about the argument that those tariffs actually ended up hurting American businesses and consumers too?
He addresses that. He knows people are concerned about that.
Yeah.
But he sees it as a short-term cost.
Like you got to spend money to make money.
Exactly. A short-term cost for a long-term gain. You got to bring China to the table, make them deal with us.
And he does point out that China did eventually agree to a new trade deal.
They did. Though whether that deal actually accomplished what it was supposed to, well, that's a whole other conversation.
It's still up for debate.
Right. And it's interesting because he actually compares Trump's approach to trade with how he handled foreign policy in general.
Really?
Yeah. Like with someone like Kim Jong-un in North Korea.
Okay. How so?
Well, Hansen says that Trump wasn't afraid to break the mold, with diplomacy.
Yeah, he didn't always follow the usual script.
Exactly. He would use bluster, he would use threats, he'd even walk away from negotiations. And Hansen argues that that actually got results.
Interesting.
Like, he points to the fact that Kim Jong-un, who had been doing all those missile tests, raising tensions with everybody, he actually agreed to meet with Trump.
He did.
Something no other president had pulled off.
Although, didn't those talks eventually fizzle out?
They did.
Yeah.
But Hansen says even the fact that they happened at all was a big deal.
Okay.
It showed that Trump was willing to try a different approach.
So he's saying that Trump's willingness to break the rules was actually a strength?
In a way, yeah. That he recognized that dealing with someone like Kim Jong-un required a different playbook.
It's like Hansen is saying that Trump's flaws were also kind of his strength.
That's the big takeaway from the book.
Yeah.
Was Trump a successful president in spite of his flaws or because of them? It's a question that people are still debating.
It's a really interesting question.
And it's one that Hansen doesn't necessarily answer for us.
Right.
But I think what makes his book so valuable is that it pushes us to think about the Trump presidency in a more nuanced way.
Beyond just the headlines and the hot takes.
Exactly. He's forcing us to confront the complexities of this really consequential figure.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to have to wrap things up, but this has been a fascinating look at a really provocative book.
It really has.
The Case for Trump by Victor Davis Hanson definitely gives you a lot to think about.
A lot to unpack, for sure.
So to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive and that it gave you some new perspectives on the Trump presidency and its lasting impact on American politics. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. That way you won't miss any of our updates. Also, if you think this video could help others, please share it with them. Thanks for watching and for your support.